Hey Tony, it's Friday, and first off, to answer your question of the week, I think fighter's a really good class for someone to start with. I also do think rogue is good as well.
So don't do it, Destin. Start
Yeah,
Artificer.
don't start as an artificer. That's just you're in for a bad time. So what I want to talk about this week is going to be a great surprise to absolutely no one. Let's talk law and politics.
Holy peanut butter and jellyfish sandwiches.
Thank you, Justice. Particularly when they intertwine. So this week has been pretty wild in Washington, insofar as one of Trump's friends and informal and informal advisors, Roger Stone, ended up prosecutors on his case. He was convicted of all sorts of lying type offenses, lying under oath, etc., etc. And the prosecutors recommended a 7 to 9 year prison sentence for him until Trump started going after the prosecution. And the DOJ basically came down and said, "No, we're not actually going to go with what these prosecutors recommend. Instead, we're gonna give him like just a handful of months." And this was a huge thing. It might seem somewhat minor for someone who's not well versed in in the history of DOJ interference, and really for the past since Watergate, the DOJ has not had interference in cases involving the president's advisors or friends. So when President Trump stepped in to basically attack this prosecution, that was a huge issue, particularly because the one thing that Trump pushed was the fact that, oh, the jury forewoman was biased against Roger Stone, which automatically makes that jury null and void, and essentially, and that's why they're going to have to probably go through a new trial, because this one here is going to get marked as a mistrial because President Trump broke a long-standing tradition of presidents not being involved in DOJ investigations. Now, the DOJ is part of the executive branch, but they're also kind of a weird in between. Like, they're primarily executive because they're under the attorney general, but they practice in the judiciary. So they're in both worlds in a way, and it's a hugely important position that needs to be free from political interference. This has been the case since Watergate. So back in Watergate, what Richard Nixon did is what was known as the Saturday Night Massacre, in which he asked his attorney general at the time to fire the special prosecutor. That attorney general refused, so Nixon fired him, and then asked the next man up to do the same thing. The next man up refused. Nixon fired him, and then Nixon himself finally got a yes man to fire the special counsel. So ever since then, that was a hugely eventful moment in the history of the DOJ, because it then set forth that the president should not be involved in DOJ investigations involving friends, confidants, allies, etc., etc. So what President Trump did is huge. It got so bad that all four prosecutors who were on the Roger Stone case resigned, which you only see that in a case where there is a massive tradition break and a massive constitutional crisis. And that's exactly what this is. Now, there's nothing constitutionally that says the president cannot have an impact on these investigations. In fact, the president being the head of the executive branch, it would probably be permissive, but there has been a long-standing tradition since the 70s that presidents do not touch DOJ investigations. So the fact that President Trump did that on this one is a massive breach of tradition and harkens back to Watergate and Richard Nixon. And this is all also in the same week when President Trump fired the two people who were involved in the impeachment hearings and kept railing against the Democrats, against Roger Stone's prosecutors, against the DOJ. In fact, Attorney General William Barr came out and said, I am not going to be bullied by any member of the government," which in its own is a hugely important thing. It doesn't usually take an acting officer of the court or an acting officer of the executive branch to step in and say, I will not be bullied. Now, whether or not this is actually going to mean anything is really up to debate, because William Barr might very well still be Trump's yes man. But what we're seeing now is something that you have to pay attention to, because this is huge. Like, this hasn't happened since the 70s, since Watergate. And with this being an election year, there's even more going on. There's going to be so much drama. And it makes me worried for what happens when we get the results in November. Because I personally do not expect President Trump to, even if he loses the popular vote in a landslide and loses the electoral vote in a landslide, I don't see him giving up power in the same way as someone else might have, who might have believed that there could have been some issues with the votes, but I don't see this ending in a peaceful, good conflict resolution. It concerns me, and the fact that our president is throwing out all these traditions and all these taboos involving what's supposed to be, in no small part, an electoral watchdog and a governmental watchdog, it makes me worried about what's going to happen. So, Tony, my question for you is, have you paid attention to this case at all? Because it's going to be a fascinating case to see in the future. Tony, I'll see you on Wednesday. Later, bro.